issues relating to personal conduct and expenses were not arising. He's now being sued in Australia for breaching his duties as a company director while leading a separate software firm. Allegations are denounced.
Further bad weather is hampering rescue efforts in the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, where record floods have left huge areas underwater. Heavy rains have led rivers, lakes overflowing, killing at least 150 people in 3 weeks. South America correspondent Emily Wells joined a rescue mission in the state's capital, Porto Alegre.
The scale of the damage is immense. Whole roads, whole neighbourhoods, in some cases whole cities underwater. It doesn't look like some of the hundreds of thousands of displaced people will have homes to return to. Thousands of people who have had to flee flooding are currently living in improvised shelters, such as one in a university sports hall. The southernmost state is planning at least 4 new tent cities to accommodate people. Many are still stranded in flooded homes, choosing not to leave for fear of being robbed. Helicopters and boats are trying to rescue people, but these operations are not without risk.
One of Ireland's leading business figures, Tony O'Reilly, has died at the age of 88. He played international rugby before going on to lead the independent news and media group, becoming journalist. A Ukrainian boxer, Alexander Usyk, has become the first undisputed world heavyweight champion in a quarter of a century after beating Tyson Fury. The fight in Saudi Arabia saw Fury begin strongly, but Usyk took charge in the 8th round, and in the 9th, Fury was given a standing count and saved by the bell. In the end, Usyk won on a split decision, but Fury insisted he would be back.
It looks like, I believe, I thought good result, but, I'm not a judge. I can't judge it like while I'm watching it. If they would have said to me in the last round or whatever, you're down, go out, try and finish him, I would have done that. But everyone in the corner believed we were up. But it was what it was. I'm not going to cry about spilled milk. I've had plenty of victories and I've gave God the glory. I've had this one loss and a close fight, with a good man like Usyk. And it was what it was.
Tyson Fury speaking in Saudi Arabia. BBC News.
Many thanks, Charles Carroll. This is BBC Radio 4 coming up next. Monsters in religions. What purpose do they serve? And then Robin Markwell examines a trial scheme to grow veg without digging on land next to the Royal Agricultural University in Gloucestershire. We'll hear more in On Your Farm. That's coming up in half an hour.
You know those times when you just can't tear yourself away from something great on Radio 4?
Well, at times people come up to me if I'm at home and I'm like, here we go. They'll say something nice about whatever film I've had just come out. Hey, can I just say it?
With most smart speakers, you can now ask BBC Sounds to pause, rewind and restart live radio.
Can I just say it? Your dad delivered me and my sister, and my mum always talks about how much she fancied your dad.
So you never have to miss another minute. To get started, just say, ask BBC Sounds.
Now on Radio 4, we're in the world of the Leviathan, avenging angels and malevolent Rakshasas. Who are the monsters in our religious stories, and why are they there?
Hello, I'm Giles Fraser, and this is Beyond Belief.
So Lilith arrived to me really as the monster, we might say, and as this demonised character with these almost fork-like legs and these extremely expansive wings, and of course she walked around naked, so her breasts were revealed. And it was said that she would come to terrorise your dreams, perhaps that she also might murder your babies or your children. She ultimately was a symbol of anger and rage and punishment, and something to be very, very wary of. And I imagine if we were also sitting around a fire back in the medieval times, I would probably be telling my kids, you need to watch what you're up to because Lilith might come and get you.
Bunny Love Shock is an interfaith minister and a practicing witch. The mythical and monstrous figure of Lilith, the demoness, is very important to her.
Lilith is many things to me, certainly even as that demoness, as the monster, we might say, and as the woman that represented the parts of us that we might consider punishable. And the thing about training as a reverend or an interfaith minister is that you have to go into all your wee cupboards, as I call them, and have a good look around and see again where there might be any monsters. And that can include hidden things such as guilt and shame, even overwhelm, confusion, chaos, trauma. So I began to have that conversation with her in meditation. And then what was also happening at the same time was that I was having lots of what I might consider visitations of her emblems and symbols. So for example, multiple owls had come to me, but not just come to me in being outside the house. They were sitting on the garden fence, they were right beside the bedroom window, they were flying in front of the car and showing me their belly through the windscreen. Nature was really, as far as I was concerned, speaking to me very clearly to consider this conversation with Lilith something to be curious about.
In several Jewish texts of the Middle Ages, Lilith appears as the first wife of Adam, who leaves the Garden of Eden, refusing to be subservient to Adam. She is sexual and defiant, but also a destructive, winged character, in some images with a serpent's tail. It's this idea of female defiance that endeared her to some who now look to her as a goddess. Bunny has her own devotional practice towards Lilith.
You know, Lilith ultimately didn't want to be, she didn't want to be oppressed, so she left the Garden of Eden, and immediately upon leaving the Garden of Eden became this demonized character. She is, in a way, the monster in all of us. She represented, especially in the Middle Ages, this feeling of isolation, this loss of power, this loss of body authority and autonomy. She was a beacon of anger and rage, and really symbolized the parts of us, the parts of humans that were repressed or had been judged. For example, the desire for pleasure or equality or equity.
Before we had Godzilla, Frankenstein or the alien, we had the monsters of ancient mythology. And they weren't just in ancient folklore, but have peered out at us from all sorts of religious texts and traditions for centuries. They may have 10 heads, a rapacious appetite for children or fearsome talons, and they jostle alongside the gods within Scripture. Those who want or expect religious texts to be all about the wholesome or the uplifting might find the presence of these fabulously disturbing creatures all a bit puzzling. Personally, I love them. But why are they there, and what function do they perform? Joining me to discuss the delicious subject of monsters and gods are a panel with many fascinating stories to tell. Natalie Lawrence is an author and illustrator with a keen interest in folklore and enchanted mythical creatures. Great that you're here.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Esther Hamori is Professor of the Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary, New York, and is the author of the, I have to say, brilliant book called God's Monsters. Hi, Esther.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to a fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Bihani Sarkar is a historian of early Indian politics, religion and literature at Lancaster University. Hi, Bihani.
Hello, very, very keen to engage in this conversation.
It's going to be fun. Esther, can I start with you? What makes a monster a monster?
Well, there's no single defining trait, but there is, I find, a collection of traits that all monsters seem to draw from. And I mean all monsters across periods and places and genres. And we can think of that in some ways as a family resemblance. And so we see a collection of traits like giant size, supernatural strength and powers, often physical hybridity.
And what was it that first drew you to the monsters of the Bible?
Well, I've always enjoyed a good monster story. Even as a kid, I was fascinated with Greek mythology and old French werewolf legends. Anything that, as I see it now, anything that offered a glimpse of a world beyond. You know, there's something very meaningful about stories that invite us to grapple with dangers we don't understand. But even so, it was a long time before my love of monsters came together with my fellowship. And in the end, they came together for personal reasons more than anything else. For me, it was a time of terrible grief that brought me to stories of biblical monsters. I felt that there was something really compelling in these ancient reflections on how grim things can be. For me, those texts offered something that prettier, simpler biblical passages couldn't, because acknowledgement of the grim has a comfort all its own.
I totally get that. When people say sometimes to me, oh, the Bible got lots of nasty bits in, I say that's really important. They should be there. Don't try and take them out. Behani, can I ask you about whether it's right to, I don't know whether the word monster or the monstrous is right to apply to sort of Hindu traditions.
Well, in the Hindu traditions, there isn't any word for monsters. There are inauspicious beings, and the landscape of these beings is vast and kaleidoscopic. And what's important to note is that these beings can be morally ambiguous. So some, for instance, can collaborate with the gods for a major project. For example, there's a very famous myth about the churning of the ocean from which the nectar of immortality is gained, and this project was a collaborative project between gods and a class of demonic beings called the Asuras. Some monsters or monstrous figures can even be elevated and deified, and then there can be some figures who can also be heroic, such as the adversary to the epic hero Rama, who's called Ravana. He's a 10-headed monstrous form, but in actual fact he's quite a heroic figure in the epic. I think the main point to note is that within the Hindu traditions, all of these various beings form a natural part of the cosmological order.
Can I bring Natalie in here? Natalie, one of the things that we're just all beginning to paint a picture of is one of those characteristics seem to be something like hybridity. Is that there's bits of one thing and bits of another, and they seem to us to be sort of glued together in improbable ways. Is that a part of the sort of like nature of the monstrous?
Very much so. I think monsters are an incredibly varied group. You can't really put them all together under one form, but you can group them by what they do. And one thing that they do is to cross boundaries. So this hybridity is represented in their forms, is representative of the fact that they are boundary crossing things. And also, if you go back to the meaning of the word monster in itself, it comes from the Latin monere, to warn, and monstrare, to demonstrate. So monsters aren't necessarily negative or dangerous things, but they are things that are demonstrative and revealing. And this is where their symbolism comes in. They kind of show things that are otherwise hidden. So when we talk about what is a monster is something that reveals something.
Esther, some of the great monsters in the Bible are sea monsters, aren't they? Like Leviathan, playing with that whole idea of our fear of the deep.
I think so. There's a really wonderful, rich, complex, and sort of disturbing range of sea monster traditions in the Bible. But for starters, I think it makes sense because in addition to classic monster traits that are part of how we can recognize a monster, we recognize that monsters live in the elsewhere and beyond places of the world. And yes, exactly. And the depths of the sea, that the furthest reaches of the elsewhere and beyond. Within the Bible, the range of sea monster traditions is, I think, pretty provocative. It gets at some of the tougher issues in the Bible, not just about the monsters God sends, but God as monsters.
Yeah, we're going to come on to that.
That's really interesting.
Behani?
Yes, I found the point about gods being monstrous very interesting from the Hindu perspective, because there are many great gods, so gods who are at the top of the pyramid of gods, and these gods have slightly dangerous and inauspicious sides. So, for example, the goddess has a side which is mild, but also a side that can be very dangerous and almost, well, very similar to Lilith. The description of Lilith in the beginning just struck me because it was so similar to a goddess called Kali in Chamunda, except in the Hindu tradition, it is this danger that is revered and exalted. It is this danger that is considered to be divine. It isn't something that is to be feared, rather it is a symbol of that particular deity's beauty.
Isn't there sort of like, you know, men fearing the sexual power of women type of going on here in the monsters? Here we've got Lilith and Kali or
So
Medusa.
there's a whole group of women, I call the snake women, but they take other forms as well, and they combine the deadly nature of snakes and the fertility of women into these terrifying, powerful beings of life and death. And in a lot of more monstrous forms like Medusa, that's the power of life has almost been subverted into the power of death, her ability to petrify with just her gaze. So I think there's a whole suite of female monsters that are kind of hybrids that embody the male terror of female power, both their sexuality and their fecundity.
But it's also male gods such as Shiva, who has a terrible side as well. And I think this point that we raised before about aspects of human nature that are uncomfortable or slightly uncontrollable, that I think these aspects of deities, or even monsters themselves, reflect these uncontrollable sides that we ourselves cannot understand. And it's reflected in some of the mythologies. For example, the legend of how one class of terrestrial monsters called the Rakshasas, they're both in this. So I find that there's a correlation between anger and monsters, or even hunger and monsters, because Kali is a very hungry goddess, and I think even today, for a woman to be hungry, or for a woman to eat or to be seen eating is considered unfeminine. So there are, all sorts of aspects of human nature that are socially uncomfortable, that I think are reflected in conceptions of unconventional beings, let's say. I don't like to use the word monsters.
One of the interesting things about Kali and her destructive power is it does seem to speak into a whole sort of cosmology in Hinduism about time and being cyclical and all that sort of thing. Have I got that right?
Yes, indeed. So Kali manifests herself at the end of the universe. According to Hindu thought, time is cyclical. So Kali is an eschatological deity. She manifests herself at that final hour when the universe is going to end, and at that point she is said to be a terrifying, huge presence. She's draped in bones, she's carrying a blood-streaked hide of an elephant, she's hungry for creatures. You know, it's also a joyful image because Kali's having a lot of fun at this point, and she's swallowing the universe into her belly, and this is the point at which the universe is destroyed. But it's a necessary destruction. Kali's monstrosity, this ravenous, hungering, fawn-like manifestation of hers, is needed by the cosmos for its rejuvenation.
Esther, one of the great sort of themes in the Bible is the eternal battle between order and chaos and so forth. You know, the creation stories about bringing order out of chaos and all of that, and that's part of the role that monsters are being called to play. Is that right?
I think we have an idea that monsters represent chaos, and gods conquer monsters and the chaos they represent. Maybe uncomfortable to some things that we see in the Bible is that a lot of the monsters in the Bible, and the most dangerous of them, those that attack and kill the most people, are not gods of omens. The most dangerous of biblical monsters are God of entourage. God is the one who deploys monsters. He sends hybrid creatures out to attack people, and angelic soldiers and other divine hitmen. He dispatches vengeful spirits to mess with people's minds. the monsters of the Bible don't represent what we're used to seeing monsters represent in mythology and religious traditions.
One of the great things that people, I think, always get wrong about the Bible is they get angels wrong, because they always think angels are these sort of like, I think Reuben has done a really bad job on angels, making them fat little babies. But then, I mean, it's not for nothing that you hear a lot in the Bible when an angel appears and they go, fear not, because they are terrifying, aren't they?
Absolutely. Fear not, I'm not here to kill you. This time, they're not that comforting.
No, I mean, they don't look like fat babies, do they? I mean, they've got multiple heads and all this sort of stuff. Why have we got angels so wrong?
I think we have a strong impulse to reimagine heavenly beings in the Bible as being purely kind and benevolent, and with angels above all others. And they are the most benevolent of heavenly beings in the Bible, but they're also the most ruthless. And what can be uncomfortable, maybe for some, is that those aren't different angels. Angels in the Bible are divine beings who do whatever job God has assigned to them in the moment. And sometimes that job is deliberate, and sometimes it's blissful. So angels in the Bible take different forms as suits their purpose, like leading the Israelites through the desert. An angel shows up as cloud by day and fire by night, and it's very practical, like what you would find in a wilderness survival guide. There's a story in which an angel slaughters 70,000 people throughout all of Israel. These are 70,000 innocent civilians in retaliation, in God's retaliation for the sin that King David committed. In this story, the angel is giant, and after it has killed 70,000 people, we see it hovering in the sky with its giant sword extended over all of Jerusalem, about to wipe out those people too. And the characters in the story are terrified, understandably. And one thing I find really striking in this story is that the emphasis over and over is on the people's fear.
Ever since I looked at your book, I've been thinking about why it might be that we have done this image shift. Why is it that we have cleaned them up and made them so much more benign in mythologies?
Right, I think it's a relatively modern sensibility that we want God and our divine beings, whoever the our is, to be benevolent, to be kind and gentle, and that was not the common understanding in ancient Southwest Asian traditions. So Mesopotamia, Canaan, ancient Syria. The point for them wasn't that gods were good and kind and loving and peaceful all the time. The point was that gods were powerful.
Bihani. It seems to me that Hinduism's a lot more grown up in this regard, with the way in which it represents the divine in this sort of more ambiguous way.
Yes, it is. I mean, I always found that within the Abrahamic tradition, it's a very polarized idea of good and bad, and what counts as good and what counts as bad. But it's a muddy